Hi, welcome to session 2 of the 9th topic of the semester. This is the last topic of the semester, titled Texas in the Age of Globalization from 1939 to the present. So we're going to look at now in this session, we're still again discussing the first part of this topic that deals with war, prosperity, and modernization. We were talking about that again in the first session. We were looking at, for example, Texas during this time participating during the Second World War. Again, that the Second World War initiates in 1939, but the United States moves into the war by the late 1941. So by the late of 1941, we're going to see, of course, the United States participating, of course, in this case, Texas as well. Again, we talked about, the great mobilization of troops, the deployment of U.S. forces to send forces to Japan to fight the Japanese, first in Asia, and then later on, of course, in Europe against the Nazis and Hitler. And of course, we talked about how Texas joined the U.S. Army, and there were about 750,000 again, Texas soldiers that joined the U.S. forces. So we were looking at that quite extensively again. So what we see is that Texas is beginning to now participate, if you will, in the global scene, okay, in the international stage for that matter, because again, this is the age of globalization. There's no longer nations are simply isolated, again, and pretty much conducting their own affairs, in total isolation from one another, but rather we're going to see an increasing interaction between nations around the 1930s and 40s, again, onwards. Again, we now see the age of globalization, something we covered, by the way, quite extensively in the very beginning of session 1. So Texas is now beginning to move outward, so to speak, and one of the first instances of this experience was during World War II. Again, when he joins, again, the war, and again, 750,000 Texans joined the armed forces. There were, of course, minorities there, Mexican Americans, African Americans, women, that, again, joined the U.S. forces, again, the armed forces. Of course, we're going to see also the expansion of military bases across Texas. We mentioned that as well in several of the major cities like Houston, Austin, San Angelo, San Marcos, Lubbock, Corpus Christi. Again, we see the expansion, of military bases as well. That was part of the change that, again, Texas is experiencing during this wartime, again, process in World War II. Of course, wartime production, Texas is going to also experience. We mentioned that again in session 1, that the expansion of military bases, of course, led to the creation of new industries like the aircraft, for example, factories, shipyards, refineries and steel plants. We talked about that quite extensively as well. Okay. The rapid mechanization of farms. We were talking about the mechanization of agricultural production because it was necessary, again, to supply the food that was needed for the country, but also for the troops fighting abroad. Okay, so we're going to see the introduction of new technologies as well in agriculture. That is going to also skyrocket, crop agriculture and the introduction of new crops. That Texas will no longer rely just on cotton production, but there's going to be a diversification, again, of different crops as well, animal farms as well. Okay, so now we left again in session 1 in a point in which we're going to see now Texas, particularly after World War II, is going to now go through a second industrial revolution of sorts. The first industrial revolution happened, back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, let's say 1880 all the way to 1920. That was the first industrializing wave, if you will, in Texas. But it's not until the end of World War II that Texas is going to experience a second wave, a second industrialization that is also going to revamp, is going to transform Texas society in dramatic ways that is going to actually accelerate this modernizing project. Again, Texas is now is going to acquire a more modern outlook, a modern society again. That is going to very rapidly leave that frontier type of society of the past, that we discussed back in the 19th century, the frontier, how people, were riding horses and they were very rugged, very individualistic, lived in small towns, very traditional. That livelihood, that romantic, if you will, if we can actually call it romantic, but that kind of romantic existence of the past is going to disappear very rapidly. The old West, if you will, the old Texas West. And we're going to see the rise of a more modern, more dynamic, society. So let's go to our slide now so we can start covering then this process. Prosperity and modernity, again, comes to Texas after World War II. Again, and we're going to see, as I mentioned, a second industrial revolution in Texas. That is going to move Texas once and for all from an agricultural economy, because even though there were industries in the past, undeniably, we discussed that quite extensively in previous topics. There were the lumber industries, there were manufacturing, industry shops, there were, metal works and so on. The oil industry. Yes, it's true. But those were not necessarily the dominant economic enterprises of Texas. Agriculture was, of course, the dominant enterprise. Okay, farming or commercial agriculture, again, that's what Texas was all about. Up to this time, but now it will be industry, industrial enterprise, industrial production is going to take center stage, and it will become the central pillar, the backbone of the Texas economy. Industrialization, factories of many kinds, refineries, industries, manufacturing plants. Again, they're going to prop up all over the state, in specific, of course, into specific regions. We're going to look at, of course, but again, this is an important change that is going to alter once and for all, the landscape, the social landscape, the way that the society was conformed in the past. That is going to rapidly disappear. And perhaps there will be spots in Texas in which people will continue that traditional livelihood of the past, but that is going to be, again, certain pockets of the state, particularly those that are centered in the rural, area, the countryside, if you will. But even the countryside is rapidly, becoming more and more interconnected with the cities and the global stage as well. As we explained that again in session 1 with the rise of new technologies and so on. It is inescapable that people are becoming aware again of the global community, okay, and global news and so on. Because of new gadgets, new technologies that are appearing very rapidly. During this time, particularly after the 1950s onwards, okay, this technological revolution in communication systems. So let's look at the second industrial revolution in Texas that moved Texas from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy again. And it's to understand that, we have to look at, for example, the rise of new industries. Okay, we're going to see the proliferation of new industries that are going to become now the pillars, the central pillars of the Texas economy. For example, number one, the petroleum industry, undeniably, oil. Again, there's a global demand, of course, for oil. And so this is not only a national demand, this is now a global demand, um, with new transportation systems, the automobile, and so on. So evidently, there's going to be a demand for oil. Um, and so Texas, of course, we discussed the development of the oil industry back in the 1890s and early 1900s along the Gulf Coast, but also in the areas where is the Lubbock, Odessa area as well of Texas, the oil fields. Okay, so those already existed, but they're going to now try to accommodate to the growing global market, okay, the growing demand, for oil. So this petroleum industry again was now flourishing, in a more significant way after World War II, as a result of new technologies that were introduced in for refining, again, refining oil, uh, industries and technologies that also involve processing different kinds of metals as well. It's called metallurgy, okay, and engineering. Okay, so again, the new technologies that are now available to process oil and to use different kinds of derivatives of oil for different kinds of industrial processes. In other words, there's a lot of manufacturing plants and industries that require some form of derivative of oil, not just gasoline. There's many derivatives, many products can be created out of it as well. Okay, so all of those technologies are emerging after World War II, which is going to launch the oil industry to a new height, uh, particularly in Texas. Okay, Texas oil, and again, there's going to be, of course, drilling offshore technologies that are now enabling uh, uh, human beings to drill oil in the ocean, guys, because offshore. In other words, it's not just that you drill, in the land and you're tapping into an oil pool or oil well. Again, you're pretty much, pump it out of the ground, but rather that because those oil wells or deposits are also found in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Gulf of Mexico itself, there's going to be a lot of drilling going on again in the ocean. That is going to, because there's new technologies, by the way, that will enable also to establish platforms, oil platforms again in the Gulf of Mexico. That is going to allow, of course, the extraction of far more oil than it was possible in the past. We're going to see the creation of 13 new ports in the Texas Coast as a result of, again, those drilling expeditions, okay, with those new technologies. Um, so more towns, if you will, more ports are being now generated in the Gulf Coast of Texas, okay? And also in West Texas, as I mentioned, we're going to see also new oil fields. Okay, so it's not just in the Texas Gulf Coast in which we're seeing more drilling, more offshore, extraction of oil and so on. But it's also, again, in West Texas as well, in places like Midland and Odessa, for example. Okay, we're going to see there new oil fields being developed that are going to mass produce, crude oil for Texas in a way that it now moved oil production in West Texas from 755 million barrels a year to 1.5 million barrels a year. Okay, it's a significant increase. And so by 1959, with those new oil fields, whether they're offshore or in West Texas, Texas is now generating 40% of the national production of oil. In other words, of all the oil extracted in the U.S., okay, by 1959, 40% comes from Texas alone. Okay, Texas, it was now generating anywhere between 2.5 to 3.2 billion barrels of oil per year. Okay, by that year. There's significant increase. And of course, there's a growing demand. There's not only automobiles, of course, but there's also airplanes, there's ships, and even railroads are now using, of course, oil as the main source of fuel, as a source of energy. Okay, for transportation purpose, pretty much virtually every transportation system, any transportation technology, again, depends on oil at this point. And since the global population is growing, again, the demand increases as well. Okay, so that allows for the flourishing of a gigantic, again, industry in Texas called the oil industry. Again, that is industrializing. Okay, it is really industrializing the state. Okay, and it's becoming more dominant, okay, industry than agriculture, even though agriculture is still, pervasive. Texas continues to produce massive amounts of cash crops for the national and international market, but nonetheless, again, industrialization is now taking more importance. So number two, there's going to be also the banking industry as well. There's going to be a new kind of finance, if you will, financial institutions that are designed almost exclusively to provide loans and credit to companies engaged in drilling, okay, and oil processing, because it requires financial assistance. This industry that it was blossoming, the oil industry, require that, okay, it's not just a matter of, drilling the oil, but the processing as well. There's a lot of plants and refineries that are going to process the oil into different products. And so the creation of those factories, the creation of those manufacturing plants and those companies that are drilling require, of course, require assistance, require loans for investments. They needed to invest in buying technologies and so on, like equipment, drilling, technologies and so on. It's, buying land and so on. So again, there's going to be, of course, the growth also of a banking industry that was becoming very interconnected with the oil industry as well. Okay. In Texas. Okay. So we're talking about Texas particularly here. Okay. So, along with that, we're going to see, of course, manufacturing as well. Okay. We're going to see the development of more and more manufacturing plants and shops, all across Texas that are going to create new jobs. As a matter of fact, by the 1950s, the new manufacturing businesses in Texas are going to create 119,132 new jobs, okay, that are going to really generate about $6.8 billion worth of, again, profits. Okay, so there's also manufacturing propping up in places like Houston and San Antonio, Austin, that, again, are providing more employment to people. So more and more people are now moving towards industry. They're hired, again, in refinery companies, in drilling companies, in oil fields, for example, or they're hired also in manufacturing plants as well. Okay, so more and more Texans are moving towards this industrial economy as well. Okay, number four, we also see the development of a defense industry. Okay, defense industry, because after World War II, even though Japan, Italy, and Germany were defeated, okay, the fascist states, we covered that again in session one, very briefly, by the way. So the situation is that after the Second World War, okay, the United States is now facing another challenge, and that is the massive expansion of the Soviet Union. Okay, the Soviet Union is expanding in different places of the globe, like, for example, in Eastern Europe, and it's also trying to exert certain influence in parts of Asia, like Korea, for example, as well. So again, we see the development of the Cold War. The Cold War. The Cold War was a rivalry, a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States for about 40 years, and that culminated sometimes in conflicts again in different parts of the world, like the Korean War, for example. The Korean War that spanned from 1950 to 1952. There was a Cold War conflict between communist and capitalist forces trying to determine the fate of Korea. Uh, so it was required, therefore, to meet the demand to to have a defense industry, the demand for a defense system, if you will, in case the Soviet Union was going to threaten, for example, Americans directly and so on. So it was necessary to have some form of defense industry, and of course, we're going to see the development of a defense industry in Texas as well. And so the defense industry, what it is again, so those are industries that manufacture war materials. Okay, like planes or tractors, jeeps, and the like. Okay, so this is something that is also flourishing. Okay, in the state as well, that people are moving there in search for work, and more people are finding work also in defense industries as well. And number five is another industry that is also going to flourish in Texas is the silicon industry, the microchip, in other words, the digital systems, the computer, okay, the digital systems, computer systems, and the like, computer technologies. And so one of the leading enterprises, again, in Texas of the silicon microchip industry was Texas Instruments. Okay. And so we're moving now by the 1950s and 60s very, very slowly but steadily towards the computer age, by the way. The development of, computer digital systems and the like, something that is going to skyrocket by the late 1980s and 90s, the computer age. So it is something that we see also in Texas arising again. There's also going to be an industry that is geared towards the production of computer systems, technologies as well. Okay. Number six, also what we see is, of course, something we talked about in the past quite briefly, is NASA. Okay. Near Houston, Texas, Spacecraft Center. Again, that is also going to be an industry in its own right, so to speak. That is also going to generate jobs as well, particularly in the Houston area. Again, we're going to see, of course, space exploration, in the 1960s, the mission to land on the moon, for example, to establish satellites, again, in outer space, and so on. So NASA is going to be instrumental in providing, again, those types of space expeditions. Those are outer space expeditions, to explore the solar system and so on. So it is in Texas, luckily, again, that we see NASA, the Spacecraft Center, being established here. So therefore, it gives Texas not only prestige, but also it gives Texas an opportunity to also attract investment, of course, to attract jobs as well, to the state. Okay. We also see the development of an automobile industry as well in Texas. That is also going to be so significant. The automobile industry, this is just providing, of course, automobiles for the peoples of Texas, for the national market as well, the manufacturing plants of automobiles. Again, there's automobile companies that are moving into Texas for manufacturing purposes. And of course, there will be tens of thousands of Texas that will be hired again in the automobile industry as well. Okay. There's also number 8 going to be the food processing plants as well. For example, cereals or the canned industries, food, canned food, and so on, uh, within Texas as well. So we're going to see the proliferation of food processing plants. That is also going to industrialize more and more the economy of Texas in a way that industries will become the most important enterprise that are going to generate most of the jobs for people to actually earn their living. Okay, so there's again a multiplicity of different industries, about 8 different industries that we mentioned that are part of this second industrial revolution taking place in the state. All right, so those industries generate uh, hundreds of thousands and millions of jobs, by the way. Okay, it really introduced a new mode of production in Texas. Is the factory system. Again, the factories are the ones pretty much producing everything that people required and so on. Most people actually work for those industries, for those factories, for wages. So there's a new mode of going about producing everything that needs to be produced again. Wages. People are now earning their living again through the payment of wages. So now, what we're also going to see in this modernization process is not just that the economy is changing and is becoming more and more oriented towards industrial capitalism, but also the modernization of Texas is taking place with the development of modern transportation systems. Again, mass transportation. This is another very visible change. And that, again, it's something that is extremely vital. Whenever a certain region or state is actually changing very rapidly because it's developing new industries and so on, it is rapidly acquiring a new economic system. For example, industries. So it's required. It is almost impossible to avoid that you need very modern, very efficient, very effective systems of transportation that will enable people to be transporting raw materials or finished manufactured products and so on to increase the rate of commerce. Again, so you need also to upgrade your transportation systems for that matter. And so Texas is going to likewise follow that pattern that, well, we're going through a second industrial revolution. So there's the need to actually provide for a more efficient, more well-developed highway system. Okay, that is going to pretty much interconnect all of those industrial centers all across Texas. All of the industries we just mentioned, they need to be interconnected. Uh, so the flow of products, goods, people's monies, investments can take place uh, very efficiently and very effectively again in Texas. Okay, so this is a very visible change. It's modernizing the system of transportation. The state funded the highway system. Roads and highways were built in such a massive scale from the 1950s and 60s. 60,000 miles of roads, were built during those 2 decades alone. 60,000 miles again of roads, and we're going to see an increase, of course, in motor vehicles. Again, a 5 million registered motor vehicles again are added again to the state. So the flow of people, the commerce that is taking place as well is intensifying And so this leads to more and more movement of people, particularly the communication, the transportation of people from the rural areas, from the countryside to the city. Okay, people in the countryside will no longer feel isolated. I mentioned this is something I mentioned in the past. That even though you still live in a very traditional setting, the rural areas, there's going to be farm roads. Okay, that are going to provide access for you to actually, use your vehicle and drive to the city. Okay, you will no longer rely on horses or ox carts, etc., or rely exclusively on railroads. For that matter, there's going to be now highways. Even this very simple farm roads, if you will, that is going to enable, once again, people living in the rural areas to travel more and more often to the cities, for visiting families, for conducting business transactions, and so on. Again, or perhaps even relocating to the city, okay, as well. So the trucks, are going to actually uh, replace the railroads. Okay, truck transports uh, are going to really replace railroads. What was actually required in the past to transport via the railroad, like grain, for example, or products like cotton or vegetables and so on, they needed to be uh, shipped through the railroads. Now trucks are going to actually do that, by the way. That railroads will continue to have its relevance, by the way, again, because like, for example, like iron ore and coal, there's very heavy materials that could be only carried, by the way, through the railroads. But nonetheless, more and more traffic, again, is going to take place in the highway system by trucks, moving products. Okay. And so this is, again, another very important, significant change that is uh, changing the way Texas was in the past. The traditional scenery, the landscape is changing very fast with rapid uh, modernization of highways and roads, okay, transportation systems. We got also air passenger traffic as well. We got, of course, more and more airports. Okay, 638 airports were built uh, from 1945 onwards. We're going to see, particularly 1945, the development of the Texas Aeronautic Commission. That is going to regulate, monitor, supervise, all air traffic, for that matter. Okay, they're going to monitor, regulate the airports as well. Okay, we're going to see the creation of about 11 airlines during this time. So once again, this very isolated existence that the peoples of Texas experienced in the past, in which the only way to travel was either by horse or the railroad and so on. So there were, very small distances that people actually traveled, by the way. Uh, Now that comes to an end. It's not just the automobile that is changing that, but also, again, the airplane. People are beginning to travel out of state. They can go to the airport, buy a ticket to visit family in different parts of the states or travel abroad and so see the world again in a whole new light. So very, very important changes taking place here. Uh, Number three, it's also that we're going to see the rise of a tourist industry. This mass transportation that we're talking about also included the development of a tourist industry as well in the state of Texas. Because people are traveling more, they're going to have, of course, more and more uh, opportunities to visit places. You got an automobile, or you get, again, the opportunity to fly to a different place and so on. And that is going to allow people to visit places to enjoy the, for example, different to enjoy different areas of Texas, for example, that they want to visit during vacation time, during the summertime or winter time. They would escape the routine of work, and they're going to vacation, so to speak. Okay, so Texas are going to be driving and flying for vacationing, and of course, merchants are going to notice. Okay, that is going to be a flow of visitors coming from different areas of Texas, but also they're coming from other states as well. That there's people coming from, let's say, New York, etc. And so they're going to accommodate in trying to actually create, places for the visitors to stay, like hotels, lodging, restaurants, resorts. And this is also going to lead to, again, a change in Texas as well, because there's going to be the rise of resorts, hotels, restaurants, and so on that are in specific areas, again, of Texas, particularly West Texas, also San Antonio as well. People want to visit certain landmarks and so on. And so we're going to see, again, the flow of foreigners, if you will, people coming not only from different parts of the United States, but also coming from different parts of the world. We're going to see this internationalism taking place in Texas as more and more visitors, more tourists are coming to Texas, again, to enjoy the scenery as well. Just a second. All right, just a quick commercial break here. All right, so what? Once again, Texas is modernizing because tourism invites people from all over the world to the state, and the peoples of Texas are able to now encounter the cultures of the world. It's not just this. It's not necessarily, again. This is not necessary for Texans to fly to different parts of the world, because the people from all over the world are coming to Texas again. So we're going to see an encounter with the cultures of the world, with the different peoples of the world, if you will. So this is what I refer as Texas in the age of globalization. Again, in that Texas is becoming part more and more of this globalized community. Okay, and the peoples of the world are becoming more integrated because there's more traveling, more communication, more transportation systems, tourism as well. That enables people to have a direct experience again with people that you have never even imagined existed in the planet. Again, different ways of dress, different ways of religious beliefs and practices, different food cultures, different traditions that the peoples of the world are actually encountering one another. This is again happening in Texas. Now, what we're going to see as well in Texas in the 1950s and 60s, particularly again when we move after World War II from 1945 all the way to 1960, is the rise of a middle class, okay, in Texas in a significant way. Now that, not that it did not exist in the past, it did indeed. The middle class existed in the past, but now we're going to see that the middle class is growing more and more in a way that is really becoming really the part of the social structure of Texas. That this has now a growing significantly, again, growing middle class, in which the middle class is really bringing about a new kind of society, okay, in Texas, a new kind of society and culture, which is really based on consumerism, again, consumer society and culture, the rise of the middle class, consumer society and culture as well. Okay. So this is something really new to the state of Texas because not that the middle class did not exist. I'm not even suggesting that at all. It's just that it was not significant, okay? And also that the values of the peoples of Texas was not necessarily all centered on consumption or consumerism for that matter. Even though there was consumption taking place in Texas, it was not that significant because the middle class had not yet acquired such a large, numbers in Texas. But now that it's growing, more and more, Texas society is oriented more and more towards the consumption of goods and services as well, and even the whole culture of Texas is changing in that direction. That the values, what people value, what people think is important in life, is again attaining middle class status and using that status, that affluence, good income and so on, uh, for the purpose of enjoying yourself, enjoying your existence on earth through the consumption again of goods and services. Now that there's a host of different industries, and we have transportation systems that are enabled, of course, the transportation of products in a very rapid way. So you can have access to a number of different products in the market. In your own city, in your own town, you're going to have a multiplicity of different products that you have never imagined before. Okay? So what led to the rise of the middle class that is going to bring this consumer society and culture is, again, the wartime industrial production of World War II, particularly. When World War II ignited in 1939, that really moved countries that were instrumental in supplying the war materials, so to speak, to the warring factions to actually meet the demand again for those war materials. So as the United States enters World War II, it was necessary again to meet the demand for the war materials and everything that was required again to win the war. So that kickstart, if you will, factories, manufacturing plants, industries in the United States, once again, after having been stagnant during the 1930s and the Great Depression, now industrial production is going to skyrocket, once again, particularly when we move into 1941, when the United States enters World War II. So that, of course, led to the creation of a multiplicity of different industries and so on. We already talked about, the second industrial revolution that took place in Texas, particularly after the end of World War II. About 8 different industries. We mentioned that, one by one. So because there's a lot of jobs, okay, because there's a lot of demand for products that during World War II were necessary to win the war, against the Japanese, the Italians, and the Germans. But now there's a Cold War, after World War II, there's now a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, of course. So this wartime industrial production continues even into the Cold War, into the 1950s, 60s, and even into the 1970s as well. Okay, of course, the Cold War is not going to end until 1991. But the 1950s and 60s was really a boom cycle, again, of new industries, proliferating across Texas. So more and more people, of course, had access to jobs. They had incomes, good paying jobs, by the way, access to education, and they could actually afford buying a house, buying an automobile, and of course, buying, a multiplicity of different products as well. So this led to the rise of the middle class. A lot of people, had means. They had incomes, they had good salaries, good paying jobs because there was a growing demand for them, by the way, okay? As more and more manufacturing plants and industries are on the rise, of course, there's a need for jobs. And people with education were the ones that were actually seizing the good paying jobs, again, in the state of Texas. So again, we're going to see the rise of the middle class. So with the rise of the middle class, uh, we're going to see that in Texas, the culture was changing because people felt that this was extremely important. Okay, what's called social mobility, that it was essential. It was extremely essential to move upward in the economic ladder. Okay, to become part of this middle class that is very comfortable. It has a house, it has a family, so on. It has a car and so on. They, invest in education and so on. So it seems like this was the ideal existence. To become part of the middle class was almost like achieving really the end goal, if you will, of what it takes to be human, fully human, by the way. But that was the highest, the peak, if you will, of the human experience. Become part of the social class called social mobility. Middle class social status. Again, people feel that this is, what we need to strive for. Okay, work very hard, try to get a good paying job, educate yourself, and try to move upward. Okay, so again, the values are changing. This is the way people in Texas more and more see the meaning of life. Uh, we're also going to see the rise of the suburbs because those that attain middle class status are moving away from the city itself. Okay, suburbs are actually areas that are situated outside of the city itself, because the cities during this time were really, particularly in the inner city, by the way, that's where most of the industries were located. Okay, manufacturing plants and so on. So in many cases, people felt that this was again areas that were very noisy. There was, very traffic, because there were thousands of people rushing to the work, to jobs and so on, during the morning time or evening time. There was pollution and so on. So they really wanted to escape, okay, that environment, and they wanted to live outside of all this uh, noise, pollution, and the like. So they created what's called the suburbs, the middle class, professionals, managers, supervisors, engineers, people with means, high paying jobs are now, they're college educated, by the way, are going to now move to the suburbs. So this is also a change that we're seeing almost in every Texas city, that there's going to be the nucleus of the city, again, what's called the inner city. And there's also going to be an outer ring, if you will, again, the suburbs, really outside of the city, if you will, in which people are pretty much creating their own communities, middle class communities. Okay. They're going to have their own shopping malls and so on, stores, movie theaters, and the like there. Okay. Very separate from the mainstream city. Okay, so this is a new way that we're going to see Texas moving into. Texas society is changing in that way with the rise of the suburbs. By the way, that is still very much alive even today as we speak. So another thing that comes with the rise of the middle class is, as I mentioned, is the rise of mass consumer culture. Okay, it's inevitable again that with the rise of this class now in Texas, there's going to be, now a tendency towards the mass consumption of goods and services, because this particular class has now the purchasing power. It has good income. It has good salaries. Again, they're well paid. So they're going to use their affluence, their incomes, their salary, their economic well-being to enjoy themselves, in other words, in this world, by buying the things that brings the most uh, pleasure to them. Okay, because now people are getting the sense that it's really pleasure, really, the meaning of human existence. This is how we become happy. The more pleasure that we can actually buy, because pleasure has to be bought. Okay, you need money if you want pleasure. That is to say, because that is the value at this time. That pleasure was regarded as happiness. The more pleasures that you enjoy, well, the more fulfillment you're going to find in this world, the more happiness, in other words. Okay? So the middle class is really pretty much transitioning into this new reality again, is consumption or consumerism. Uh, of course, in the state of Texas, this consumer culture was aided in no small part by the rise of new media outlets, okay? Like magazines, for example, radio and television, that are going to be used for what is called mass advertisement. That is to say, mass advertisement, commercial, okay? In other words, so all of the new industries and businesses and shops that are proliferating in Texas and nationwide, what they're actually doing is that they're using the mediums of communication, of mass communication, which again, what people are actually, use for informing themselves, that if they want to read about what is going on in the world or in the nation, etc., is reading magazines, for example, listening to the radio, and now there's going to be a television as well. And so those media outlets are going to be used by the growing industries, not only within Texas, but nationwide, in order to advertise the products that they're selling, by the way. Okay. So they're going to create commercials. They're going to craft commercials in such a way that they're going to tell the consumer that what they're actually buying is not really the product itself that they're actually offering you. What they're going to tell you through those commercials is that what you're actually buying is that you're buying happiness. Okay? So all commercials, this is the essence of advertisement, by the way. When you see a commercial anywhere, even a billboard, by the way, when you're driving in the road and so on. So anytime you see a commercial, okay, whether it's online or you see it on TV, etc., on a billboard, a magazine, doesn't matter. The essence is that what you're seeing there is a company that is actually offering you something that is going to make you happy. That is the essence of it. Okay, if you buy this, you will be happy. Okay, so they're actually selling you happiness more so than the product itself. Perhaps that's the strategy. It's a psychological strategy, by the way, to use happiness as a way to, convince people that this is what you need. In other words, not because you actually need it, because, you're going to just need, a pair of shoes, because you need to cover your feet, but rather because those shoes are going to make you feel in a certain way that in the end, whatever it is that you're going to feel about it is that you're going to be very happy, in other words, because you're going to feel secure, because you're going to feel that you are beautiful or very popular or cool, whatever it is. But that makes you happy, in other words. Well, that is the essence of advertisement. So this is more and more what we see in Texas, particularly by the 1950s. From the 1950s onwards, you're going to see mass advertisement in radio, television, magazines, in which there's now inescapable to see commercials, okay, selling you something, but in reality, they're actually offering you happiness, in other words, okay? The consumption of happiness, and not only that, but also social status, that also the idea is that, well, if you want to demonstrate to your peers, to the members of your community, that you have now attained a middle class status, is that you need to buy this because this particular brand, this product with this brand is going to be so fancy, so classy, that if you buy it, you're going to also demonstrate that you have become part of the middle class, this successful class, in other words. Okay, so more and more people are becoming more and more oriented uh, towards that particular value of life. Okay, that this is what is valuable. We need to become part of the middle class, and we need to consume products because that's the way we become happy. In other words, okay. So with that, it's also going to come along with this consumer culture that I just explained. We're also going to see the introduction of new pleasures and leisure pastimes as well. That was part also, again, of the rise of this middle class, this consumer society and culture, is that, well, it is true, consumption is becoming central to people's lives, uh, but there's also the idea that when you become part of the middle class, you also have a significant amount of time, free time, to pretty much pursue activities that are going to bring you pleasure. You're going to engage in leisure pastimes as well. That is going to, again, pretty much enable you to enjoy your existence as well. Okay, because you work from Monday to Friday, then you have the weekends off. You perhaps have certain vacations, again, once or twice a year. And so you want to use this free time that you have because you're now acquired this new status in order to pursue those new pleasurable activities, if you will, like tourism. I mentioned San Antonio, Texas is going to be, part of the growing tourist industry in the state. Okay, and people are pretty much spending time, again, this leisure time, in visiting places for leisure, for amusement, visiting the missions and the religious Spanish missions, again, of the 16 and 1700s, that are still there, the ruins or archaeological sites or landmarks and so on. There's also going to be film and movie theaters as well, all over Texas. People are going to also go to to watch movies, go to a film, or see a play, watch a play again, go to the theater. There's going to be plays now in the cities in which people can actually see an entire play from Shakespeare and so on. Again, it's this culture, if you will. You want to use your free time to also explore the high culture, if you will, again, by going to the movie theater. Sports as well. Okay, people spend some time in sports, attending football games. High school and colleges all over Texas are going to really invest significant resources in the development of football teams. And this is what people really enjoy. Parents seeing their children play in high school, events, sports events, football games, and so on, or college level football as well. This is going to be one of the preferred leisure activities in Texas. Golf as well, the development of golf courses. People use golf as a sort of therapy, to escape, the routine of work, to, stress management and so on. Very relaxing, etc. Again, Texans are going to be very fond of golf during this time. And this is, again, part of the rise of the middle class, by the way. The middle class is the one that is, in a certain sense, pretty much bringing that into existence, even though golf is associated with an elite, kind of pastime that only the upper class, the very, very rich, participate in. And that is partially true. This is not to deny that fact that the most affluent, the wealthiest people again in society are golfers. Of course, it's true. But the middle class, because it aspires to for social mobility, it wants to move upward. It aspires to acquire a higher social status. Well, it sees in golf as a way to become part of this elite, if you will, in which, people that are very affluent, that have, good paying jobs and so on, a high status can participate in. So it's a way to pretty much try to show status as well, high status, golf. Not all people, of course. Some people actually find golf, very relaxing, by the way. This is not to generalize, but, there's a certain tendency, if you will, to participate in certain leisure pastimes as a way to demonstrate status. So, okay, so besides sports events like football and golf, you're going to see also theater. Theater plays, as I mentioned, dramas and all sorts of different plays are going to be also proliferating across Texas. This is what people, particularly the middle class, again, is very fond of, going to the theater, for example, okay, to watch a play. And there's also going to be inside of the theaters, symphonies, okay, orchestras, operas that people are also very, very attracted to. Classical music, listening to the exquisite compositions, again, of the classical masters, the classical composers like Mozart, for example, Vivaldi, Bach, and so on. So again, people are going to be very, very amused again by those sounds, and it's very soothing, by the way. And people see that as part of the high culture as well. Look, this is high culture, comes from Europe. And so the middle class has that aspiration to absorb the highest expressions, the highest cultural expressions, again, of other civilizations or their own civilization for that matter, their artistic expressions. Okay. And in Texas, this is happening, of course. And also we're going to see popular music venues. This is another pastime. Pleasurable leisure pastime, so to speak. People are going to enjoy the new genres of the day, in which we see, of course, bands playing live again in venues, whether they're in restaurants or bars or they're outdoors in concerts. Again, they're going to be jazz bands, blues in Texas, the Texas blues around the Austin area. They're still very famous for, by the way. Country music is also going to be a kind of feature of Texas musical culture, and likewise rock and roll. Once we move into the 1950s and 60s, rock and roll is so going to become also central, to Texas music that most people are finding fulfillment. They enjoy, spending time in those venues because they now have the time to do that. So Texas is really changing in very dramatic ways because, again, the way people lived in the past is something we covered quite extensively in previous topics. By the 1950s and 60s, again, there's a whole new society. There's a whole new culture on the rise that is becoming more modern, more oriented towards the economy, like high social status, middle class, consumer values, for example, and of course, a society that is enjoying, of course, their free time on venues and leisure pastimes and the like, again. And is finding more and more encounters with the rest of the world as well, again, through traveling and tourism and the like. So this is really a dramatic shift, okay, in the state of Texas. Now let's look into part two by looking at Texas in transition. This is part two, again, of this topic that is now going to look at the state of Texas now, and now moving in very rapidly, even more so, from 1960 to 1986, now that it has pretty much acquire a more modern outlook, very prosperous, economy and society, uh, we're going to see now dramatic changes in the way people socialize with one another. Okay, the really integration, if you will, of minority groups into the life of the state and the life of the nation. This process is called integration. Okay, the integration of ethnic minorities, but other minorities as well, again into Texas society. That is also going to change the traditional structures of the past, in which certain ethnicities were pretty much relegated to live segregated and to not really be taken into account, by the way, okay, in the political process of the state, like voting or holding office and so on, or earning the same amount of money, again, equal pay and so on. So ethnic minorities were pretty much relegated once again to live uh, in, pretty much uh, on the outskirts, if you will, okay, of the political and economic life of the state. But now there's going to be an intense effort again to integrate all the peoples of Texas. And of course, this was also a national process, by the way. It's not just a Texas process, but it was also a national process that was also moving the country in that direction, in which we're going to see now a movement we call the civil rights movement that is trying to get the all of the peoples regard of the country, all people, all citizens, regardless of race, color, sex, nationality, religion, any background, again, to become fully integrated into the political uh, life of the country, the right to vote, the right to hold office, and also to gain also access, equal opportunity to economic resources such as good paying jobs, equal pay, between men and women, okay, and equal access to good education, etc. Again, so a more equitable society, if you will, to grant equality to all people, regardless of their background. So that's what we mean about Texas in transition. There's a transition stage that is taking Texas now into a new social landscape. Okay, so the old norms, the old structures of the past are shaken. Let us just put it that way. To the point that the way that the society was organized and how people were supposed to uh, follow certain norms, again, in which one group was dominant and the other one was less dominant or subordinated and so on, or marginalized, that all of those norms, again, of the past that limited the ability of people to be taken into account, that those norms are going to be severely disrupted and shaken, in Texas. And Texas is going through a transition phase, if you will, okay, towards a kind of a new society, if you will, the transition towards something new. At least this is what, again, those years from 1960 to 1986, something that we are going to see very clearly here. Okay, so let's look at, just very quickly, okay, some of the issues that is going to move Texas towards this new reality, so to speak. Okay, so first, during those years, the Texas economy is going to blossom even further than what it had been blossoming in the past with the development of new industries. We're going to see the development of new industries, such as the aerospace industry, for example. During those years, there's going to be new industries that is also going to allow for the further blossoming again of the Texas economy. The aerospace industries were industries; those were actually industries that were in charge of providing the wherewithal, the materials, the supplies, the technologies that were instrumental for launching, for example, satellites in outer space. Okay, satellites. For communication purposes, I should say, the development of satellites for things like radio waves and so on, for communication systems, for the growing computer digital systems again that are on the rise during this time, and also for space exploration. In order to explore outer space, there was also the need to manufacture, the shuttles and so on, rockets and the like, the platforms and the like. Again, everything that was necessary to launch expeditions out of space, to launch expeditions in terms of satellites or, sending a mission again, to explore the moon or Mars, in which there's going to be, of course, a kind of a monitoring, if you will, monitoring technologies doing that, of course. All of that, led to the development, again, of the aerospace industry in Texas as well. Okay. The biomedical industry is also emerging in Texas during this time. The biomedical industry are just industries that manufacture medical devices. Okay, surgery, for example, equipment, prosthetics, for example, dental devices, and the like. Again, medical devices. Okay, therapeutics as well, and pharmaceutical. Pharmaceutical industries was part of this biomedical industry. Pharmaceuticals, medicine, etc., of all kinds. Manufactured in the state of Texas as well. Okay, so this is also part of moving Texas into this new reality, this new Texas, so to speak. Something that we're going to see, of course, in part 3, and once we move into session 3, a new Texas. But this is the transition stage, moving Texas towards something totally new. And number 3, the oil industry, even though we already talked about how it blossomed after World War II, there's going to be even a further increase in the oil industry, in oil production particularly, because now the world is becoming far more globalized as well. There's an increase in the world population. It is increasing dramatically during this time. The world population, by the way, that with the advanced transportation systems that we just talked about, in the past, that really created now the demand, a world market, a greater and greater demand for oil, gasoline and so on around the world. So more so, as the world is increasing in population, there's more technologies, transportation technologies, the demand for oil increases. So therefore, this industry is still acquire a greater and greater significance, in the state of Texas. So that's important. Again, that we got a boom period, an economic, if you will, boom cycle during this time from 1960 to 1986. That is moving Texas towards this transition. A more heavily industrialized state, so to speak. Okay. So an industrial society, for that matter. Okay. But even more so than that, what really is going to lead Texas to move Texas towards this a new society, so to speak, as I just explained a moment ago, again, is a movement to that was launched by minorities in this case, for the most part, not all of them, but this is a movement of minorities that were attempting to create a more equitable society, okay, to integrate all of the citizens of the state and also all the citizens of the country, for that matter, into the political and economic life of the nation. Okay, it's fully integrated. More equitable, more democratic. Again, more integrated society. Okay, this is called the civil rights movement or the civil rights crusade, as it was called, a movement towards civil rights. To grant civil rights, civil liberties to people that were not really enjoying those rights equally, let us just say, as the mainstream society again, particularly white males, okay, white males, because even women, by the way, even women were not really enjoying equal rights, because they were considered, of course, subordinated to men. So let's look very briefly here at the historical and global background uh, of the Civil Rights Crusade. Okay, so it's very, it's going to be a very quick, pretty much overview here, looking at the historical and global background. In other words, why is it that we're going to see in the 1960s, particularly the 1960s and 70s, a civil rights movement taking place in Texas is due to several factors that are historical, but also are factors that deal with this global or international context that Texas is now finding in itself in. Okay, so number one of the first, factors that led to the civil rights movement again is that there was a massive population increase. You know, uh, First and foremost, this is extremely important to understand, essential, by the way, that the civil rights movement was a movement launched by millions of citizens all over the country and also in the state of Texas, by the way, that really believed that a new and better society could be created. Okay, they believed in reform, and the reason why this is so is because there were millions of people. There was a massive population increase, and with a population increase, what we see is that as more and more minds, in other words, okay, coexist, co-inhabit the world, there's more ideas. Okay, people are start breaking away from the patterns of thought of the past because more and more people are, alive. They're coming into the world. There's an increasing population, and this new generation, this new massive increase of people are going to bring new ideas. It was now possible to materialize those ideas, and most of those ideas had to deal with creating a more democratic society, by the way. Okay, so it's a massive population increase, and what we mean about the massive population increase, we're referring to the generation that is going to be involved in the civil rights movement. And the generation that was involved in the civil rights movement was the baby boomer generation, the baby boomers. Those are considered or labeled as baby boomers because this generation uh, was a generation that came into the world from 1945 to 90, particularly, in which in that 15-year period, there was a massive population increase, not only in Texas and not only in the United States, but worldwide, by the way. It's a worldwide phenomenon, by the way. Okay. But in just the United States alone, we're going to see that in that 15-year period, there was a 30% population increase. It's a massive increase, 30%. And 50 million babies were born during this time. So there's, of course, some explanations as to why this is so. And we just explained, again, there is, affluence taking place with wartime industrial production. Industries are flourishing. There's more jobs. And so with more jobs, more employment. And with that, of course, more and more people, have, opportunities to earn a living. There's an affluence. This is called affluence. And affluence is, again, the ability to sustain yourself, that you have a good paying job, you have good income, that is to say. So you have a decent standard of living, in other words. Okay. So that will enable people to actually have a family, to, bring kids into the world, because, there's plenty of economic opportunity. There's jobs all around you, of course, so there's affluence in that, coupled with improved health science during this time. There's the development of the polio vaccine by Dr. Jonas Salk, and the penicillin, okay, the antibacterial, medication to fight bacterial infections, penicillin. So those particular innovations in medical science, again, is going to now increase the lifespan of human beings that otherwise in the past were more likely to die of very young age, from, bacterial infections or from polio. It took a heavy toll on children, by the way. But now more and more children are finding that they can actually grow into adulthood. So that allow for, affluence and the development of those medical improvements and technologies for a population increase, about 30% in the country, the baby boomers, that is to say. So this is a generation that is just so numerous, if you will, that by 1950s, they're going to be so numerous. So therefore, there's going to be a lot of ideas in the air, a lot of minds that are going to be pondering about the world around them. And they're going to be thinking about changing certain structures that they found to be obsolete, in other words, worn out, in other words, things of the past, those were not really consistent with ideas that they held very dear, like, for example, equity or democracy, for example, human rights, and so on. Okay, so that's number one. The other factor that led to this civil rights crusade is what is called the rise of a new form of liberalism. All right, there's new liberals on the rise. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, we're going to see that there was a growing trend within the Democratic Party. The left wing, it was called the left wing of the Democratic Party, called themselves the New Liberals. They said, yeah, we are liberals, but we're new liberals in the sense that we're really seeing that democracy, okay, is not really well understood. What they were trying to do is say, we're trying to really redefine what the democracy really means, because they believe that people during this time simply believe, traditional Democrats who call themselves liberals simply saw democracy as a philosophy that granted citizens the right to life, liberty, and property. That was democracy. This really an political system that provides protection, again, to certain rights, like life, liberty, property. So they said that's democracy. When you have a political system that protects and grants those rights to the citizens, you have a democratic society. But the new liberals are saying that's not really the whole picture, okay? Because when you look at the 19th century, slave owners were Democrats, by the way, because for the South, the South that seceded from the Union, by the way, they were actually Democrats, by the way. That was a party of the South that supported slavery and secession, that seceded from the Union and waged war against the North, because they believed that they had the right to property. In other words, that slave owners were fighting to defend their right to property. What was property for them? Slavery. Okay, so the new liberals are saying, wait a minute, democracy cannot just be life, liberty, and property, because even the slave owners were Democrats. So we need to redefine democracy. And so what the new liberals are saying, even Texas and all over the country, is that the meaning of democracy, the essence is, again, a philosophy that actually says that all human beings are created equal. Okay, all human beings, regardless of race, color, sex, gender, nationality, religion, caste, or national background, doesn't matter. Okay, social class and so on, that we're all created equal. Okay, so if you have a political system, they said, that calls itself democratic, that actually treats all citizens equally, regardless of their background or skin color or ethnicity, language, or whatever, then you have a democratic society. Okay, that's democracy. So it's, again, equality. So equality is democracy, in other words. So that's another issue that we're going to see now, a new movement even growing within the Democratic Party that is actually saying, look, we need to really become truly democratic, because we're not. We need to treat everybody equal. That all people that are not yet treated equally, that don't have equal opportunities presented to them to participate in politics, to hold office, to vote, to have good education, etc. We need to guarantee that all people are going to have those opportunities to be treated equally before the law. That's democracy. And so now there's going to be also international factors that are going to come together, to launch the civil rights crusade. The international factors is, the fact that during World War II, minorities actually joined the armed forces to fight the Nazis, in Europe. They were fighting the Nazis. They were fighting the racism of the Nazis. In other words, we're fighting, the Nazis because we want to stop their racist, ideologies and so on. So there were African Americans, there were Mexican Americans in Texas that joined the armed forces to fight, overseas, the fascists, the Japanese, the Italians, the Germans, some racism. So, of course, this is a factor that also is going to contribute to the civil rights movement, because people are saying, wait a minute. So we cannot, behave in this fashion. We cannot behave in a racist fashion, or have institutions or laws that enable racism, because we just came from the experience, again, of World War II, fighting racism. So we need to make sure that we don't practice it here as well. So again, this launched also the civil rights movement, because people felt that this was, of course, their duty as well. And of course, the other issue, the international factor, again, are the pressures of the Cold War. After World War II, there's now a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. They're competing in the world stage to prove which system was going to be better, to create, the ideal existence for people. The United States represented capitalism and democracy, and the Soviet Union represented communism and one-party rule, one-party state. So they were competing to say which of those two can actually create the ideal conditions for people to live happy. So now the Cold War, that starts about 1947 onwards, it ends in 1991, put pressure again to the institutions here at home in the state of Texas, for the institutions to change, because we need to change ourselves. We need to improve the way we live. We need to become more democratic, because we're trying to prove that the ideal political system is democracy. This is where people are taken into account, that people vote, that people have a voice, that people express themselves, called democracy. And so whatever elements, again, are in our society that are undemocratic, well, we need to address them, because we have now media, of course, television and so on, news, that inform societies around the world, how people live in different countries. So that means that other countries have access to, again, to see how we actually live here in the United States, and particularly here in the state of Texas. So we need to make sure that we change again those undemocratic, situations, those the undemocratic conditions that we still have, of course. So this is another issue that is going to lead to the civil rights movement. Okay, so this is all I have for you from session 2. When we come back, we're going to look at the background of minorities, the experience of Texas women, for example, the experience of Texas Mexicans, the African Americans in Texas as well, and of course their participation in the civil rights movement, civil rights legislation in the state of Texas as well, and their activisms and so on as well. Everything when we come back. And finally, in session 3, we're going to look at a new Texas from 1986 onwards. Again, looking at a new Texas as well. Everything when we come back, again, in session 3. This is all I have for you. Then I'll see you then in the next session, session 3, for the conclusion of this last topic, Texas in the Age of Globalization. Everything when we come back. Thank you. Bye-bye.